Before I began offering you my analyses of the most recent Democratic primary debates that occurred this week, I had been speaking to you through a series of video, blog, chats, posts, whatever we want to call them, been speaking to you about moving someplace better. And so I'm going to continue with that series of thoughts, and I'm going to leave off where I'm going to start back where I left off, which was I was talking to you about moving to South Beach. Now, one of the most important things for me to talk about, my being in South Beach and the state of my mind in South Beach and the complexity and at times horribleness that was my experience in South Beach, it must be understood that it all stems from my nihilism. That being said, the personal flare of nihilism that I experienced couldn't be understood without discussing a few other relevant factors. Specifically, there are personal psychological factors, and there are also aspects of prior philosophical development that all sort of collide and create this very nihilistic way of thinking. Now, sometimes I think I should do what Ayn Rand likes to do in her essays and define her terms. I want to be clear from the get-go what I mean by nihilism, and I even think it's important for me to explain to you why it matters so much to me to talk to you about nihilism and my experience as a nihilist. So let's start with what I mean by the concept. When I think of nihilism, I think of it, quite literally. I understand it to be literally the obliteration of all values and meaning to a point where there can be no sense of truth whatsoever. And so when you perceive reality, what is it that you're suddenly perceiving but a sort of aimless, meaningless, purposeless existence, and you don't even know why you move forward, but perhaps you do. I mean, I would imagine, in fact, it's a nihilistic viewpoint that drives many people to suicide, I think, if they don't have the right psychological defense mechanisms for it, I would imagine. Conceptually and abstractly speaking, that's what I mean. In my case, what was going on in terms of what was the specific kind of nihilism that I was experiencing, the best way to put it is that it was actually good intentioned, ironically. I just had a thought that I needed to write down to complete. I like to do little mind map outlines as I prepare these talking head video blogs. Ultimately, I wanted to be a good person. I don't know. I haven't done research on the topic to successfully quantify, is that everybody's goal? Does everybody think that they are actually striving for good? Or there are people who inherently don't believe in even the human capacity for good, and therefore do bad, knowing that, or believing that, to them, the bad is all there is. I don't know. It's interesting, I was having a conversation with my coworkers at the tutoring center, and we're talking about criminals and the glorification of certain kinds of criminals on TV. And one brand that came up was, the kind of person who finds him or herself in a bad situation and therefore thinks that he or she can disregard the law. And to me that raises the question also, do we have a similar view of ethics? Or is there a social view of ethics? Is there any kind of like unifying, universal view of ethics? Or like a majority or plurality view of ethics out there? Or metaphysical conception of the universe even? And how that applies to, let's say, a person's drive to be a good person. I think if I could offer one bit of supplementary suggested materials that you might want to contemplate as you also contemplate what I'm telling you now. The greatest piece of writing I've ever encountered, which I believe describes pretty close to where I was in my mind with the best articulation, is Fyodor Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, in which the main character is essentially a nihilist. And the novel is, in great part, a grappling with the question of nihilism and can we have any values? How can we have values if we have no absolute truth? How can we have absolute truth if we live in a world where there is absolute truth and science is the answer to everything, and everything is so easily, ultimately reducible to formulas that our own fates are easily deciphered to a point where there's no mystery or suspense or even a sense of privacy or self or individuality, and everything is just, you know, an algorithm. We're all just algorithms in space. And how do we grapple with that thought or feeling or idea? I think Dostoevsky explores those kinds of questions really well in that novel. It would be just several months upon leaving South Beach that I would discover that book for the first time. And if you're wondering why it resonated so perfectly, well, this is why. And I had also told you that I had been compared during my time in South Beach by one girl from Brazil as quite like Nietzsche. This was before having read him. Point being, anyway, so I'm there in South Beach living life with struggling with a lot of philosophical questions and meaning really well, actually, but having a sort of complex array of factors, and that's what I want to talk to you about now, so that I don't linger on any further. Ultimately, I think it would be problematic to, I have to decide, is it more important to start with the psychological context or the philosophical context? I want to start actually with the psychological context, because I think that with the right philosophical ways of thinking, it might be easier to actually take on troubling psychological issues. Whereas in contrast, I think starting with the philosophy and then getting lost in the psychology, I don't know, actually. I have to do an experiment and try it one way first and see. If you read on the homepage of my website, you'll see I do talk about the trouble that comes with freedom, which is how to make a choice when several choices seem fair or reasonable. Another conversation for another time. Don't want to digress too much. But I think the most contextually important lens through which to view my entire youth, actually, is understanding my anxiety in that psychological context, because it's been one of the most consequential aspects of my life, which I've only in about the last year, at 33 years old now, really understood. And the reality of my presence in South Beach and my state of mind in South Beach, psychological and philosophical, wouldn't make any sense without understanding the extremity, the intensity of my anxiety, which had been exacerbated from smoking pot for about a year at that point in time. Do you not love coffee? But I'm gonna... One thing I don't like about this mug is that the top makes it harder for the coffee to come out. Though at the same time, I like the fact that it forces the drinking of the coffee to go by slower. I have an hour plus drive ahead of me anyway, so it'll be nice to have some coffee for the road. But it's also nice to have some coffee now. I don't know the first time that I experienced or was aware of any sense of anxiety per se. I remember some of my earliest feelings of fear. I don't know whether it was or not anxiety. I can tell you, this is another sort of important contextual preface through which I don't think if I don't tell you this, I think nothing else makes sense. The evidence is highly suggestive that, number one, my anxiety is a result of extremely low levels of serotonin. This appeared to be clear upon taking Effexor, which is an SNRI and ups the serotonin level, among the neurotransmitters in the brain. And I could tell you that within 24 hours of taking my Effexor, I had felt a tranquility, a peace of mind, an ability to think that I had never before experienced in my entire life. And that in the months to follow, I began experiencing greater levels of calmness and greater ability to focus and think, and even deeper experiences of self-esteem than I had ever experienced before. And it became clear as the months of treatment with Effexor proceeded that, in fact, much of my life prior had been seriously tainted by a rather debilitating sort of anxiety, actually, that I just hadn't even really fully wrapped my mind around. Now, I wasn't terribly conscious of having anxiety as such when I was really young. I had it and experienced it in a kind of almost like feeling of paranoia when I was really young. The best way I could describe it to you is this. I was afraid that everybody hated me. I know it's kind of like a weird thing to say, and I don't know if anyone else out there has ever felt that way. But just in terms of like social interactions with people, I had this fixed assumption very quickly by maybe 5, 6, 7 years old. It was fixed pretty quickly in my brain. This idea that it was expected that anybody I interacted with probably hated me and thought I was a freak. And I don't really know where that came from. I really can't blame my parents on that one, because whatever disagreements I might have with them, none of them ever made me feel that way, so I don't know where it comes from. Again, I actually think part of it is a development of thinking that occurred as a result of low serotonin, which I think causes a depressed and constantly anxious viewpoint, and which causes probably the cementing of certain principles, such as a fear of like all people, such as I felt. So I always felt, therefore, extraordinarily anxious around everybody, and a fear of really talking so much to just about anybody. There were weird exceptions to the rule, I think, when I was able to establish pretty deep relationships with a few select people. And that usually was the case through sort of like intellectual relationships. That is, when I could meet someone who liked to wrap their minds really deeply around subjects. Yeah, even when I was really young, I mean, by the time I was in 4th grade, I was obsessed with movies and acting and aspects of writing and art and such. And so anyone who was sort of interested very deeply in talking about those things, those were people I was sort of quickly able to establish relationships with. I'm not sure it curtailed the depths of anxiety that I felt. However, it certainly enabled me to have some semblance of a social life that wasn't pure paranoia of sorts at that age. Now, the other thing that occurred was this sense of, it wasn't just a social thing, and I believe I have talked about this before. It'll be a motif anytime I reflect on my youth. I was convinced I was also incompetent. And I also am not 100% sure where this starts, though my theory, my working hypothesis or theory on the development of my view of self as incompetent is not purely based on sort of depressed levels of serotonin, though I think it's a significant factor. To that end, I should be clear that depression runs in my family. It's genetic. My grandmother on my father's side suffered from the most severe case of depression I've ever been witness to. The best illustration I can give you for this is that when we would visit her, despite being physically extraordinarily healthy, I mean, she lived to be 90 plus years old, she was usually so depressed that when grandchildren and my father and we all come to visit her, she would at times not even acknowledge us. She'd look at us perhaps as if to see that we were there, but then not pay any attention to us, and we would talk to her, and she just wouldn't care to listen. And there was no indication, at least as I observed, that it was a result of any kind of dementia or senility, but rather just depression. And in fact, the story goes that her depression was so severe that she had been in the hospital for it, and that she has received multiple electroshock therapy treatments, and that her depression was exceptionally severe, such as I've not really learned about many people having a case quite as horrifying as hers. And I'm talking about in personal experience. Obviously, I've heard of mental illness far beyond that, which has been pretty awful for some people. So my point being that there is clearly a sort of genetic link to, I think, things in my mind resulting perhaps in a certain like depressiveness, anxiety, self-esteem issues, things like in that family of thoughts and ideas. But actually, I may have told you also, you're aware that I have an eye problem. I have something called esophoria, so that it's really hard for my eyes to focus. You might also do you ever notice that my head is in a tilt? That's actually as a result of my eye issue, my esophoria. My eyes go like this, and it's very hard for them to focus on what's in front of me. And so they pretty much do a double take on everything I focus on. And the way my doctor put it, my eyes essentially work twice as hard to perceive in front of me. So it's very draining on my eyes. And at its worst, it causes like mad vertigo and panic attacks and sweating and all these awful kinds of feelings. Anyway, so why do I bring this up as something? A few things. When I was in preschool, I could not color in the lines. I still have somewhere, I believe, the things that I tried to color in preschool, and I colored all over the place. I used to think maybe this was evidence of me just wanting to think outside the box. Prior to that, I thought it was pure incompetence, actually. But in retrospect and in hindsight, I think it's because I really have trouble seeing things, and I really have trouble with like basic depth perception. Things that are really hard for me, for example, like when I'm driving and I need to park, seeing right in front of me and gauging my distance to the curb, or I get super anxious when there are cars on the other side of the road to my right or to my left. I feel that they're closer to me than they really are. I know some people tell me that who don't have esophoria that have that experience too, but I tell you, I experience that pretty intensely. And I have awful hand-eye coordination, and there are just issues with the way I move. Even my back and my difficulty with posture appears to have a kind of relationship with the way my eyes sort of go like that. And I used to get made fun of for the way I walked when I was in like elementary, middle school. I don't remember exactly what it was about it, but I do remember people commenting on it. And one guy had coined the term the Sean O'Connor walk because I walked so weird. I believe that is also a result of the esophoria. And I used to get really dizzy in the car and think I was going to throw up. And I think those may have been esophoric spells, possibly. Anyway, point being that anxiety goes way back to my earliest days in life and had different kinds of manifestations. I didn't do homework because schoolwork, I didn't think I was capable of it, because it made me anxious and because I thought I was incompetent and things of that nature. So growing up with this way of thinking, developing, and I think when we have strongly held convictions or views, they harden and develop and grow more complicated as they apply to different aspects of our lives, as we apply them mentally. And so I became a sort of, almost philosophically anxious. This idea that essentially there is cause for anxiety in life in general as a sort of metaphysical principle. That's why I say there is such a profound relationship between psychology and philosophy, because we can have certain psychological conditions or repetitive patterns of thought that become like basic fundamental philosophical principles for us. And so issues of relating to anxiety were front and center for me. That said, they were never, I had only had one or two, maybe three really severe anxiety, like outright panic attacks in my childhood and adolescence. I did not have an extraordinarily severe panic attack until I started smoking pot. That really opened the floodgates for a sort of new level of mad anxiety that I hadn't experienced before. And I've talked to you about that in previous videos at length, so I'm not going to really delve too much into that now. Especially now, this is a year later after having gone through really bad spells of paranoia and panic attacks and things while and not while smoking pot. And it was always just sort of getting worse and worse. I can remember having a panic attack one day in South Beach, the condo of the girl I was dating at the time. And I remember her idea was like, maybe give him some chamomile tea and that would chill him out. I was having panic attacks all the time. And to me, it was like inexplicable. I didn't really know exactly what was going on about that. I did try, I think, Zoloft very briefly, though I was so anxious and paranoid and skeptical. Now we get into sort of like, it's almost like a sort of psychoepistemological principle here. I also grew very skeptical and was afraid of the Zoloft, so I didn't take it. It had given me, I don't remember anymore the reaction it gave me, but I was scared of it, so I didn't really take it, despite being prescribed the Zoloft. Instead, I tried to seek some kind of like therapy through natural supplements like St. John's wort or kava or something like that, these kinds of things. So there's sort of like this awful anxiety thing going on, and it's coupled with, right, because I self-loathe and because I think everyone else hates me, right, there is a sort of inherent skepticism about my reality and my life, and that plays also into like my atheism and my view on the ideologies other people have and their inabilities for the most part to like influence the way I would think at the time. So there's the anxiety factor there. There's also the fact that I was actually severely depressed. I cried a lot when I lived in South Beach, and in that I started crying pretty severely and often when I started smoking pot, actually. I broke down and sobbed the second time I smoked, and thereafter I would just sometimes just sob. And yeah, I became a weeper. And that would go on to be a problem for many years, actually. A most awful depression. I can remember one of the most horrific depressive episodes I ever had was when I was actually having left South Beach. So you see, the problem doesn't go away just upon leaving South Beach, but it becomes really coloring that chapter in my life and a viewpoint that really became cemented at that time. I was in a community college class, I don't remember which class, and I felt so depressed that I had to leave the classroom, go into the bathroom, and just sob for like 20 minutes. I don't remember what about, to be honest. That's how depressed I was. I was just purely depressed. It is what it is. With respect to the unique brand of depression I felt when living in South Beach, a lot of it came from, and this is where like we see another sort of philosophy psychology relationship, right? Obviously, if you think that you're useless and incompetent, and you think that everyone else thinks that of you, and you therefore don't really have high expectations for yourself, and you have this horribly low self-esteem, therefore, I mean, depression is a natural consequence. So there's the chemical element, and then there's the situational or intellectually induced kind of anxiety, depression, and they're sort of mixing with each other, creating this deeper depression. And then you add to it actually this fear of death and this conviction that I was not meant to live long at the time. I fancied myself quite like Rimbaud or Jim Morrison. I thought I was this cool, sexy, hip, free-thinking poet of sorts who would die young because as my sight. As one therapist who I sat in one session with would once put it, I probably feared success because I feared loss, because I'd been used to losing things, or sense of losing things. This would only get worse actually as life would go on, but that's a different situation. Anyway, so I'm just in this horribly depressed, anxious mentality living in South Beach, despite the fact that I find, you know, the beach beautiful and the palm trees beautiful and enjoy the climate. I wasn't able to do it because I was just so damn anxious and depressed and self-loathing. And it didn't help that I was often smoking pot during my free time. So that's the psychological context. The philosophical context that begins to develop, I'm just going to give you a quick preview of it because I've reached the 30-minute mark and don't like to go over 30 minutes. Is this, though. I was, at that time, more or less a pretty staunch atheist, or having atheistic thoughts. I'm not sure when I was officially sort of not. There was a point when I was flirting with belief in like angels and things like that. Get really out there. But I was essentially an atheist most of my life. I mean, if you have seen past video blogs, you know that that was paramount to understanding. In fact, my adolescence was my atheism. My atheism was my gateway to poetry and philosophy. It was like the most... My atheism, in fact, took me away in many respects from my anxiety. My atheism gave me a sense of intellectualism. It gave me a sense of competence. It gave me a sense of being a free thinker. It gave me a sense of saying I can think logically. It gave me a sense of identity. Did I already say that? My atheism gave me a sort of assertively philosophical intellectual principle to lock on that sort of, I believed, was divorced from my psychology. But the consequence of my atheism outright was, first of all, since especially going to Florida Gulf Coast University, there were a lot of Christians there that I was exposed to, but also with respect to religions I was exposed to growing up, it was Christianity that I was most exposed to, and the repressive ideas associated with many interpretations of Christianity that I was most exposed to. So to me, the most unfortunate and problematic alternative philosophical idea to atheism was Christianity. So I was vehemently anti-Christian. And because I perceived that so much of our society was Christian, I sort of was inherently troubled by most of society, dismissing most of society as brainwashed by Christianity. And therefore I was not able to trust anybody, and I didn't really care what anybody said about anything, unless it clearly related to one of my own convictions or you know, insecurities that they could relate to somehow. And the thing is that more broadly, all this is representative of an attempt to be a free thinker. Because atheism wasn't merely about being an atheist for me. Atheism to me was a result of free thought, and it was also a sort of source of free thought, and it was also sort of a manifestation of free thought. That is to say, if you think freely, with the application of logic, I should say, or science, it would become obvious that there is no God. That was sort of one of my most basic fundamental principles. But secondly, as a result of being an atheist, I was therefore free of ideological viewpoints which would enslave me to false notions or obligations. For example, right, I had this desire to be a starving artist. That was my dream, to be the starving poet artist guy. And there were people who were like, no, 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 you have to be practical and find ways to make money. And I was like, F that, because I'm an atheist and I'm free of all of these materialistic or warped viewpoints. I just have my own brand of atheism. I'm free of everything. To me, atheism was synonymous with freedom from everything. Now, not from ethics. If you read, for example, Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and you'll see that one of the arguments against atheism is that without God there is no ethics. That is totally not a fair argument. And I did have a sense of ethics. What I didn't have was an education in how to think about ethics. What I didn't have was a solid and well thought out, defined view of ethics. But obviously I had a sort of sense of values. But this is where the nihilism really gets in, right? Because the values that I held, and I'm speaking in the most metaphysical sense of the fact that this is why nihilism becomes a really complex topic. Because on the one hand, things tend to have almost no meaning, right? There can be no such thing as pure meaninglessness. I think the only logical consequence of pure conviction and pure meaninglessness would probably be suicide. So I think most experiences of nihilism, especially the kind I have, never quite get to that point. But things are essentially or mostly meaningless or mostly valueless. But every human has a hierarchy of values. Every human has a sense of, like, on the list of things in the universe that I pay attention to, or at least focus my mind on, there are things that I will focus more on and less on. And in that sense, I had a sense of things that were worth paying at least attention to and things that were sort of right and wrong. At this point in time, right, one of my ethical priorities was an attempt at romantic love. And that's a sort of ironic offshoot of the kinds of ways in which I was thinking at this time. As I've told you in the past, that I was also a determinist. And part of my determinism was this notion that I was going to magically become a rich and famous poet. But right, that's in the sort of economic and self-actualizing productivity realm of, like, life and personal experience. But one of the others for me was this idea of romantic love that I had. And I also had a very fatalistic, deterministic view of romantic love. I believed that the romantic relationship I was in, that girl and I believed that it was fate for us to be together. Now here's where things get very complicated, and here's where the application of my nihilism and my determinism become really ugly for me. And in a way, sort of inadvertently cruel. And make me so sorry. And I will leave you with this thought, as I've gone far over the time than I expected. I thought it was fate for this girl and I to be together, perhaps forever, even though we were, like, really different in a lot of different ways and fought and argued a lot. Arguments which most of the time I actually started, but that's a whole other conversation. So I thought, even if there was this sort of, like, inevitable damnedness about our awful chemistry, our unfortunate chemistry, and by the way, most of it's my fault, and I can elaborate on that in the future, but to me, it was nonetheless fate that it was supposed to be that way. And I had these ideas on what it means to commit, despite commitment being, like, a disastrous thing, perhaps, or being disingenuous, etc., etc. Because I had these fixed notions of what my fate was going to be. And so it caused this sort of romantic relationship that was not based primarily on assertive beliefs in any kind of free will, right? I wasn't fully engaged in this relationship merely because I wanted to be. Even though there were parts of me that did want to be, and the desires did exist, because things are never so, right, things are nuanced. But in terms of, like, the most basic thoughts, to me, the most important thought about the relationship that I had in that time was that it was just meant to be for us, and that nothing else mattered, no matter what other trouble may arise between us. And I'm going to stop it there, and there will be more to tell you about the philosophical, psychological complexities of living in South Beach and all I associate with moving there, thinking I had been moving someplace better, but perhaps wasn't, and in fact was only in a place where my ideology and psychology wreaked havoc on me. I will talk to you again quite soon. Have a great day. Bye.